We're going to get started. We have an awesome and expert presenter today, and with all expert presenters, she has a ton of great content to get through, so we're not going to burn up too much more time. My name is Josh Pelham. I am an employee at the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, where we have a mission to accelerate the adoption of energy efficient products, services, and practices. And we accomplish that by working with stakeholders and key decision makers up and down supply chains to essentially transform entire markets. NEA is a nonprofit organization and alliance of more than 140 utilities and energy efficiency organizations that all work collaboratively on behalf of more than 13 million energy consumers across the Northwest. Includes Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So what are we doing here? What are we hoping to accomplish? NEA works to transform markets across all sectors. Wherever we see opportunity for energy efficiency and to get it adopted more quickly, we will play in that market. And one of the bigger ones that we have, one of the greater opportunities, as we all know, is in the commercial building sector. In 1997, NEA created its Better Bricks program and platform. And in 1999, the first betterbricks.com launched. NEA is quite proud of that. It felt like it was on the cutting edge of all the .com stuff. And Better Bricks has been around ever since in various shapes and forms. It has ebbed and flowed with the commercial market. So it has scaled up and been really involved in deep energy retrofits and scaled down to just kind of give recognition and resources through the website. With the emergence of building performance standards, there is a renewed opportunity in the commercial sector, and NEA and Better Bricks are really ramping up to support the market as it seeks to find paths to comply with these building performance standards and other similar policies that require taking a look at their buildings again and figuring out how to invest in those in smart ways. So really excited. We're focused on this market, and we want to provide as many resources and as much support as we can. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So what is Better Bricks exactly? Visit betterbricks.com, whether you design, build, manage, operate a building, touch it in any way, shape, or form. We hope to have the tools and resources you need to incorporate efficiency into your work, into your building, and make those investment decisions really, really work for you and get the most out of them. We have a LinkedIn, we have a YouTube. You can follow us there, check out our videos. We put a lot of the great stuff out there, including a recording of this. And by the way, this is being recorded, just so you all know. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So with NEA's refocus on the commercial sector, which I'm quite thrilled about, we've done a lot of talking to the market, including some formal research. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how do I finance these buildings, or how do I navigate the financing around these upgrade projects? And there's so much to consider around this. And between that and planning out these upgrades, which I think the planning and the financing, they really need to work together. It's a consistent barrier. So I'm really pleased to have Molly McCabe, who we've worked with for many years now, with us today to talk about that very thing. She's an absolute expert. I'm going to let her give you her bona fides on all of that. But welcome, Molly. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. But before I do that, Molly's got a couple questions and activities for you all to contribute here. But feel free to ask questions throughout via chat, and Molly will be monitoring that. I will be helping monitor that, and we will hopefully have a dialogue throughout. We're looking for a really, interactive hour here. With that, great. Molly, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here. There are many of you I know in the room, so I'm really delighted to see you all in here. I will give you a quick, what I would love before we start is, as I'm talking, particularly now, I'd love to know kind of who's in the room. So if you could type that in the chat box, and probably even more important than that is, what will be the most important thing that would be helpful to you for you to learn today. And that may drive how we move through the program. So I may move to different slides based on what you're telling me. And I would ask Josh and the team at the NIA side to, highlight anything for me that if in case I missed it. So again, thanks so much. I have worked with NIA for, probably more than 10 years. I am the CEO of Hayden Tanner, which is an investment and a development firm, real estate firm. I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit called the Lotus Campaign, which brings together unlikely allies to solve homelessness. I'm now simply on the board of that, so no longer active directly, but it is an important issue to me as well. We've titled this particular session, Financing Solutions for Decarbonization Projects, but I think of it more of like, how do you increase your return on investment in light of some of these clean energy and building performance standards, changing demographics in terms of your tenant markets and things like that. And what strategies and solutions that decarbonize your buildings will also benefit you on the long-term returns. And then how do you pay for it? So as we go through this, next slide, please, Renee. So I think perhaps many of you might have seen this. I don't know if you saw this particular headline in the Washington Post earlier, a couple of weeks ago. But I think the same questions that consumers are seeing as it relates to their decisions on how to buy a resilient house, I think we're finding the same questions are being raised on commercial buildings. And many of this is driven by concerns and risk, right? And how do you ensure that the asset that you have continues to be strong and healthy over the long term, and that you're able to benefit as much as possible from that? Next slide, please. Oh, well. Okay, so here's what we know. And this came from some research that we did a couple of years ago, particularly in this case was for the HVAC sector for NIA. But what we found is that regardless of what you do, investors and owners are only going to do things that benefit, add economic value to the building. So regardless, even with building performance standards coming in and clean energy standards coming in, unless they can see an added value to it or a risk or a cost to that, they're not going to do it. I mean, maybe you do it because it feels good, but from a real estate perspective, you really want to understand what's the cost of it, what's the timing, when do I have to do it, and what's the long-term value of that. If you have competing capital needs, how do you choose, I'm going to do some sort of a decarbonization project, or, am I going to replace the elevator, for example? And how do I make any sort of a case that it has some sort of value to the asset? If I do it, how long can I milk the system? Or do I have to rip it out right now and replace it? So these are some of the questions that your building occupants are considering, because they do have competing priorities. And now with building performance standards coming in, the question is, what's the cost of non-compliance? And do I need to add that? And if I add that into my analysis of my building operations, how long can I not comply? And what's the trade-off? So these things tend to be concerns and opportunities that owners of buildings, whether you're a for-profit developer, long-term asset owner, or even say you're, maybe if you're a government entity owning assets. These are all questions that you're thinking about. Next slide, please. So let me do a quick run of show, because I think the most important thing here is understanding kind of what are the market dynamics, what is going to drive a decision to make certain types of decarbonization strategies and put them in play. When do you do it? What are certain strategies and what's available from the federal government, state governments, CPACE, other types of financing structures, and how do you make those upgrades cost effective, and how do you finance the project? In May, there was a presentation that NIA did with Heather Burpee, Chris Meek, and Mike Hatton, and I know that Chris is online right now. I have the link is here, and you'll have this in the recording. I really encourage you to go back and look at that. It was an excellent presentation on strategies and sequencing, and they showed some terrific examples of what is the, how do you do it? How do you pay for some of your future decisions by doing some early things now? Next slide, please. So we also did some analysis back in earlier this year, actually, and talked in late last year, and talked to some developers about, why would you renovate and when do you renovate? And I think there were two sort of pieces that fell out of that I think are interesting. One was, well, and this is a direct quote from one of our investor developer clients, was, you're going to look for the problem children first. Where are you seeing, gosh, this asset has vacant space? So what's causing that? You're going to look at where you have system failure and where you have performance problems, which will sort of drive, oh gosh, we have a lot of heating calls or a lot of air conditioning calls, or, my tenants are calling because the glass in the windows, the seal has broken, things like that. You might notice that, your energy cost has gone up because your usage has gone up. So those are some signs that, that might drive you to do something. And today, our compliance issues related to building performance standards and other things. On the other side, the other time you might do it is when you have an asset acquisition, when you have a tenant that's turned over and or is looking for expansion. So there's an opportunity to do some renovation at that point. If you're an investor and you want to do a value add project, so you're going to be you're canvassing the market and you say, well, this building looks good. Can we do some renovation there? And or if you're an owner user, kind of rehabbing for your own use. And I want to highlight some of those bottom ones. See, the top ones are problems, the bottom ones are opportunities, because it drives when you do, how you finance, and when you can finance. So some of the ones on the bottom half, you're going to find you're going to be financing through pretty traditional sources. You're buying an asset, you're going to get a mortgage. Can you put some money into your loan amount that will help you do some rehab? And or you're going to get a line of credit, so or you're using some capital, you've been doing some capital planning, and so you have some money in there. So I just want to sort of a couple of different ways to look at this. So next slide, please. I know most of you know this. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on the building performance standards, but this is driving a lot of decision making, and more importantly, in terms of some of the analysis that people are doing, they're saying in Washington, for example, the first sort of requirements for reporting are coming in 2026. In Oregon, it's a couple of years later. And people currently, and what we learned when we did some research last year, was that people are actually analyzing in their economics and how they're framing to their investor owners or their managers, what's the cost of noncompliance, and how, is it easier to do the work today, or is it cheaper and easier to just wait and see what, how much, what we're going to need to do. So next slide, please. Yeah, again, these are the building performance standards in Washington. You can see those are coming into play for buildings that are over 220,000 square feet. Great question, Chad. I'm just sort of noticing the slide that's coming up. So these are some real, these assets are happening right now. So you need to start getting on top of things today. And the penalty for non-compliance is fairly steep, and it is ongoing. It is an annual assessment. So when you're running your numbers, you need to think about what's that cost. Next slide, please. So again, I want to really highlight the things that Chris and Heather and Mike talked about in their presentation back in May, and that is the importance of sequencing and having a stage approach. There are critical junctures when these opportunities come up. So first off, O&M. I think Mike Hatton had this great an example of a building that he was working on where by simply doing some O&M analysis and some commissioning, they found that in fact they were not utilizing the benefits of the systems that were even in place. How do you manage occupant behavior, right? So how many people are leaving lights on? You know, do you have a heater by your desk, which admittedly I do right now at my office? What kind of lighting is in there? So a number of these kinds of staged approaches, these systems, by saving money on these systems, you're able to save for later. And then what's your capital planning? So making sure you have a budget in place and you're looking forward and you're putting money aside for the longer term and larger capital projects that need to happen. Again, I know that you all recognize this, but I think it's important to understand we need to have an integrated plan so you're not looking at everything in silos when you make those decisions. Leverage those operational savings from the front end, put them into a separate line item, save them so you can utilize them when you need to do some other things later. Next slide, please. So this reads directly to Chad's question here about the assessment of a building's energy performance and not having direct access to bills. And I think that that's one of the things that some of the having building-wide utility data is crucial, particularly with building performance standards coming into place, to be able to analyze both your exposure and to analyze your opportunities. And some states are requiring utilities to actually make that available and to building owners. Some states, some owners are now starting to write this into their lease structures so that the tenants are required to share that information. But, you know, transparency is really crucial here. And if we don't understand the full measure of what's happening in a building, not only do we not know where we can make changes, we also don't know what our exposure is. And so at the end of the deck, the ULI and the Greenprint Foundation have come up with a sort of a checklist of things, and I'll show it to you. Checklist of things on when you're looking in a building, what are the questions you need to be asking? And so and I don't think that's just for existing for buildings you're acquiring. Look at it for your entire portfolio right now. Okay, so next slide, please. I think oftentimes we look right now and we find that we feel like we're in a situation, we're in a maze and we have no idea where to go and how to finance this, or even finding financing or funding strategies is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. We're also, even when we can sort of get out of the maze and we can see that there are opportunities, what we're finding, and I say this from a personal perspective, what I'm finding, because we're doing some projects right now, is that we have to do a capital stack. And it's not as simple as simply going to the bank and making, you know, just getting a traditional loan. And so it's more akin to, in many cases, if anyone on the call has done low-income housing and is used to sort of doing a capital, you know, bringing in all sorts of different sorts of funding. So it's a little more challenging to do things that are very isolated. And that's why in the end, we'll talk a little bit more about how can you just do it in a more traditional sense. But let me talk right now about what the opportunities are that are available that are kind of slot into that capital stack, and so you can sort of add this to this to this. And we'll talk about some of the programs that are available. So next slide. Great, thank you. So the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act put forth a boatload of capital into the market. And so we're going to talk about 5 programs from that. Then we'll also talk a little bit about kind of rebates, incentives, and grants, what it means to be a tax credit and how that gets applied through your capital stack and when you get the money. We're not going to talk a lot about, performance contracting. We are going to talk about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and green bank loans. We're not going to talk about CPACE, but I'm happy to talk about it at some point down the road. And then we'll talk a little bit about if you're doing an acquisition or a rehab, how do you frame your financial analysis to most beneficially highlight the decarbonization strategies in order to make it simpler for your lender or your investor to make that decision to go ahead and do it. So next slide, please. So one of the things that is fascinating today, and I think that this particular administration, the Biden administration, has done is they have put in probably the single largest opportunity from the federal government to fund energy resilience and climate change strategies. It's about in the infrastructure or in the IRA, it was about $370 billion has gone in and is running through the system right now. We're also seeing similar numbers as it relates to water and some conservation issues. So, the time is now. This is a truly a generational opportunity, and to the extent that you can take advantage of it, I really encourage you to do so. So the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% over the 2005 baseline by 2030, and there are different strategies, and some of them are really easy to access and some of them are a little bit more challenging. So the IRA encompasses 4 primary strategies, 4 primary tax incentives for real estate. Before we get into the next slides, I really want to thank Ben Evans from the USGBC because I cribbed heavily from his work and his summary. So if you've seen him present, his slides are fantastic and more detailed than these ones. But again, much of the stuff that is here in these next slides came from him. So next slide, please. Okay, so Section 45L, which is part of the IRA Section 13304, the new energy efficient homes credit. What's most interesting here is that it was expanded, and previously for multifamily, it was limited to 3 stories of building of only 3 stories, and now you can apply it to any project. So if you meet Energy Star criteria, you get a $2,500 per unit tax credit. If you meet the DOE Zero Energy Ready Homes, you get a $5,000 credit per unit. So you can sort of start to see how these numbers add up. Again, there are certain requirements such as prevailing wage, and there's prevailing wage requirements, which in some states that's more challenging than in other states. Like for example, in Montana, where I live, it's a little bit more challenging, less because of the prevailing wage piece and more because of the reporting requirements. So many of our contractors and subcontractors are just not tracking it in that way. So it makes it more challenging to take advantage of it. So it's something to think about. So again, the credit is taken by the contractor or the developer in the year that the property was basically put in service, whether it was sold, if it's a single family home, if it was sold, or it was leased for a multifamily project. Next slide. Section 179D, which has been around for quite some time. Again, that was also expanded this year for energy efficient buildings. And in this case, it increased the deduction, which was $1.80 per square foot, to a sliding scale, again, depending on the efficiency you put in, to between $2.50 and $5 per square foot. Again, There are certain requirements in terms of what you must achieve. And part of what I wanted to do is keep many of Ben's, again, many of these are Ben's informational slides in, because later you can go back and pull these and look at them. Again, prevailing wages, it's important, to keep that up. In this particular one, this is a new pathway for nonprofits will be able to access the 179D tax deduction by allocating it to the project designer and government entities as well. So again, that gives a new pathway for nonprofits and government and entities to be able to hand over that benefit so that they can take advantage of it as well. Next slide. Then you have the Section 48 Clean Energy Investment Tax Credit. And again, that's rooftop solar, ground source heat pumps, and so forth. Again, you get a credit of about 30% of your investment. If again, these wage and apprenticeship provisions are met. And there's some other tax credit bonuses. So the maximum tax credit bonus for this is 70%. So you can start to think about, if you put certain amounts in, and I believe on this one, you have, I think it's up to $100,000. So that's per project, and that may be the next one. And I apologize, I can't recall. But again, this one also has new options for direct pay for government and nonprofit entities to use this tax credit. So even though nonprofits and government entities don't have a tax liability, they can share this benefit with their partners who do have a tax liability. And you can come up with some agreements with your partners so that the non-taxable entities get a benefit. Next slide. And then if you put EV charging systems on your property, you can then get, here's the $100,000. You can get a credit of up to $100,000 per charging unit on your property. So again, I'm working on a project right now. We're looking at putting in 5 charging units. Previously, the cap was 30,000. Now it's 100,000 per charging unit. So that's a big benefit for us if we can do that. That could really offsets the cost of putting that in. Again, you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Some states it's easier. My state's a little more challenging. So it's something we're thinking very heavily about. How do we ensure that our contractors and subcontractors are able to meet this? Again, includes that direct pay and transfer provisions for the nonprofits and government entities. Next slide, please. There's also some home energy rebates. Again, about $4.3 billion have gone into this one. The rebates are between $2,000 and $8,000 per individual household or multifamily unit, right? So if you look at it, I talked a little bit about the capital stack, and you start to see where you're starting to add these various factors up. So again, $2,000, if you have 100 units of a multifamily project and you're doing energy efficient appliances, that's a pretty big deal. So thinking about that. Next slide. And I think that this particular one has kind of flown under the radar a bit. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund created a new $27 billion green bank through the EPA. This one's particularly interesting to me because the awards literally just came out this summer. There's $14 billion that's going through the National Clean Investment Fund. 3 national nonprofits were given that money that is then dropped down to some sub grantees, which we're going to talk about in a second. And those are actually like loan funds or grant funds. So for example, you might find that for example, we talked a little bit about CPACE. CPACE has capital pricing, which is similar to mortgage debt, maybe even a little bit higher, whereas money's coming from the National Clean Investment Fund and sort of act as gap financing, but it's at a lower interest rate. So I talked a little bit the other day with one of the entities, one of the sub-grantees, and they said, maybe 3.5%, 4%. So that's a pretty significant drop in terms of your energy, your pricing. Again, prevailing wages are in place, and there's also a BOBA, Buy America. I'm gonna get it wrong, but it's basically buy and build American with American goods. And for that one's probably less problematic than the prevailing wages for our business. Again, because we're in Montana and our contractors are not necessarily tracking their staff and where they're coming from. But then there are two other factors. The $6 billion community investment accelerator, that's to help increase the capacity of local financial institutions to do more of this type of financing. And then Solar for All, which is enabling community-wide solar, particularly in low income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So lots of acronyms, lots of information. Here's a great resource for you, Fund Hub Washington. I highly encourage you to go to this website, even if you're not in Washington State, and to sort through. You can sort by what type of an entity you are. Are you a nonprofit? Are you a commercial business? Are you a developer? What type of entity, what sector you're working in, and then what types of activities are the different funding sources for. And so I'm fairly certain that all of the grantees and sub-grantees like CCEF and Craft 3 and the Energy Resilience Fund are captured within this database. And so if you're looking for a specific financing opportunity, I highly recommend you go there, and it gives you names, contact information, and what they're looking for, and when the applications are available. So all of the new funds that literally just came through this summer are available, and you can find it online. So I really encourage you to take a quick look at that and those different funding sources. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to give you one example of some funds. So again, the $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund went into three categories. Under the National Clean Investment Fund, monies were given to three nonprofits. So one of the nonprofits that was awarded the monies was the Coalition for Green Capital. They got $5 billion. They then subawarded to several subawardees that are located in different EPA districts. So for example, CCEF, which is based in Colorado, has EPA District 8, which is the district that I am in. It's Montana, Montana, Utah, North and South Dakota, Colorado, and Wyoming. CCEF is offering flexible terms and below market interest rates for gap financing for anything that is a greenhouse gas reduction strategy on buildings. They have about $136 million that's already been allocated. They are looking to put this money out, $136 million next year. While they're focused in EPA District 8, they say that if there's a project and it's bigger than that, if you reach out to them, they would be willing to see if they can bring in other partners. So I say that because, my sense from some of these strategies in the Pacific Northwest, it's a little bit more challenging because your building codes and your you already are fairly efficient. So those greenhouse gas emission strategy reductions are hard to meet for new construction. However, for existing projects that need to be rehabbed, there's some great opportunities. So again, in this case, anything that's sort of a net zero emissions building, new construction or rehab, they're looking at distributed energy generation and storage. They're also looking at some transportation opportunities, which probably are less valuable to this group. Some of the measures that you can finance are HVAC, EV charging, the envelope, building envelope elevators. And again, each project about $1 million or up over the next year. So if you have a project that you're looking for gap financing that looks like about $1 million, this would be a great opportunity to talk with them. And her comment to me, just so you have a framework, was, you know, we have indicative rates right now of about 4%. We're willing to look at things that maybe if your pro forma doesn't, if 4% is not the right number, we're willing to look at something else. Terms are flexible, you know, amortizing over 15 years perhaps. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities out there, particularly with this greenhouse gas reduction fund. Craft 3 probably is likely to get some of those funds. And again, go back to Hub Washington that I showed you on the prior slide, because that's the way you can look at where those funds are coming out within your whatever community you're in. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an example. And again, I hat tip to Ben Evans at USGBC. I sort of simplified this a little bit. But if you take, for example, all of those different opportunities that are available through the IRA and other federal funds that are coming out today, here's the benefit for say 100 unit project, 150,000 square feet. So if you apply for Section 45L, the tax credit for high efficiency homes, and you have, you know, you met Energy Star, $2,500 per unit, that's a $250,000 tax credit. If you also, because these can be stacked, if you also meet, you know, 179D, and you got a 35% reduction in energy use intensity as compared to conventional, that is a $3.50 per square foot tax deduction. So not a tax credit. So a tax credit, to remind you, is a direct offset to your tax liability. A tax deduction reduces your income, your net income, your taxable income. So if you have this tax deduction of $525,000 and you're in a 25% tax bracket, that reduces your tax burden by about $131,000. If you do some rooftop solar on a $400,000 investment, that's about $160,000 tax credit. If you put in some EV chargers, that's a $30,000 tax credit. And if you use the greenhouse gas reduction fund to get some low income financing for that, say, you know, maybe at 4%, that's about, say, $600,000 interest savings. You just saved yourself about almost $1.2 million on your investment. Not a bad, you know, return. The challenge, again, you have to remember is all those tax credits, you have to pay for those first. You do not get those until you file your taxes. And you don't get those unless you have a tax liability. So that's sort of the challenge of how do you pay for it. It's a great back end benefit other than the $600,000 in interest savings, but some of the stuff is not available until later, and some of the stuff is not available for those who are nonprofits or government entities that don't pay taxes unless they have those direct pay opportunities to offset those and share those with your partners. I want to take a moment because I think we're going to move into some other things here. Does anybody have any questions with regards to sort of the federal opportunities? Okay.
You know, hopefully we have some time at the end. I don't know if you want to save this, Molly, but and it looks like Chad might be adding something else. But I really appreciated his question about how to assess the potential opportunity to improve energy performance, which may be a little less related directly to the you know, financing and kind of ROI there. But there are a lot of other energy experts on here, and so that's a really fascinating problem. And so if anybody else wants to think how they, you know, what they might want to contribute to that might be something that we could chat about, because that was really interesting, something I never heard about. So but it looks like you have a new question there, Molly.
Well, yeah, Chad, it's a great question, Chad. I don't know what the haircuts are right now. And again, that's a great question because, those move over time and depends on, what the market looks like. And I haven't gone to market recently. The last time I was out, yeah, I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer on that one right now. And probably because I was looking at I was actually looking at new market tax credits and about a year and a half ago, and it just didn't make sense for us. So no great answer on that one, Chad. Sorry. And I think, yeah, go ahead to the next slide. Which is really, sort of part of what was the cost for the measures in the hypothetical? I'd have to go back and look at that, Poppy. Don't know off the top of my head. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know that. Yeah. So I don't know what the question was, what were the cost measures for the hypothetical multifamily building? And I don't know that off the top of my head, and I apologize for that. But yeah, part of what we're trying to look at now is, how do you actually make the business case and what is that risk and the opportunity? I think maybe what would be beneficial, Renee, is to go to slide, hang on. So yes, that's a good slide to go to first. So here's that sustainability pre-bid checklist. Again, it's available on ULI. There's a link at the bottom, I think, of the second page. And if you look at that, what you'll see these are just some questions to be asking around, what's, in this case, what kinds of fuel, what kind of fuel does it use, right? What kind of fuel does the building use? What's its current Energy Star score? Is it fall under some sort of building performance standard? And so therefore, are you getting information or are you not getting information? And so is it in compliance or is it not? I mean, we've had some interesting situations here, particularly say for in New York, where somebody's gone out to buy a building. They did not do this kind of analysis and work on it. And they didn't look at the building in advance and found that the building was not in compliance. And there were some actually fairly sizable penalties which did not show up in the analysis on the front end. And there were some things that needed to be done. And the investor had to go back to the city and say, hey, we've got to negotiate some of these things because it's going to take us a little bit of time to get this done. So again, you can do this both for your existing buildings, existing portfolio, as well as anything you're buying. So I really encourage you to go to the ULI website. Again, the next slide, I think at the very bottom, has the report and where you can find it. So you can go ahead and actually download this. It's free to download. Use it for your existing portfolio. Use it for buildings you're looking at, and so forth, because I think that's a really important component. I'd like to go to skip through to the next slide. Actually, go to the slide. Let me tell you what slide exactly I want to look at. Is go to slide. No, I mean these are all good. These are all good slides. Yeah. So I want to go to some of the analysis here. Right. See, this is actually kind of speaks to this. Speaks to Chad's comment for a new build investment he reviewed. The total energy performance green improvement was 5.2 million, but because the scope was actually replacing only a portion, they had to look at it. So I want to go to this one because I think these next two slides are kind of interesting. So these are actual examples of projects that we've worked on, and in particular, this one comes from a colleague of mine, Kevin Bates, who's at Sharp Development. So we start to look at, how do you actually evaluate these kinds of analyses? And so to Chad's point, if you look at this, so the importance of sort of the strategic and integrated analysis. So in this case, what we did is we said, we want to put in new windows. We want to do the envelope first, right? So glazing and insulation. So that was $100 grand. Because we did that first, again, looking at the sequencing that, Chris and Heather and Mike talked about, because we did that first, we could then downsize the mechanical systems as a result of basically, closing down the envelope. So that meant our systems there were $60,000 less than it would have been earlier. So that our net delta on it was only 40,000, as compared to saying, well, it was 100,000, right? So because we have this smaller mechanical system, we also have lower reserve requirements because for ongoing maintenance. So instead of these big units, we have smaller units. So we are only putting aside less money than we were before. So we have reduced capital expenditure reserves, which means our net operating income is higher on a bottom line basis. Then we have a 50% reduction in our maintenance costs, again, because we have smaller units. Again, maintenance bill just went down, so we have higher net operating income. We also are saving in energy. So that's an operational savings. So that also drives it through a higher NOI. The net benefit on this particular project, even though we spent $40,000 up front, there was a net upsizing in terms of what we would have otherwise spent for a conventional system, was $200,000. So if you think about that and you take that $200,000 net benefit and you say that your net operating income just increased by $200,000 a year, and then you did a capitalization rate analysis on that, that means the value of your asset just went up by that much. So when you turn around and try and sell that or refinance it, you're gaining the benefit of that value premium in your long-term asset value. Let me go to the next slide, which may also give you a slightly different example on this. In this case, again, very specific project. It was the cost of a new HVAC unit that in fact, in this case, was requested by the tenant because it was a triple net lease. The system was failing. The tenant did not want to pay for a new HVAC unit or didn't have the capacity to do it. And they said to the landlord, "Are you willing to pay for it?" The landlord said, "Yes, but if we're going to do that, we also want to put in some new energy efficiency measures. The cost of that is $286,000. We, the landlord, will pay for that. But we want you to amortize that amount in your lease term over the next 10 years. So in order to do that, the tenant said, "Okay, we will do that." So they increased the rent by $48,000, but the tenant saved almost $50,000 due to the new efficiency benefits. So they actually got a $2,000 benefit to the tenant, but to the landlord, they got basically a $48,000 rent increase for 10 years. They turned around and sold the building and made $932,000 for selling because they increased the rent on the building from their initial investment of $286,000. So sometimes, again, we need to be thinking about these investments in a slightly different way. So we have sort of the financing piece, which is, all this money that's out there, whether it's the federal government or whether it's through a bank. And part of the analysis that we need to be making, part of the conversation we need to be having with our investors, with our lenders, is if we do these efficiency units or this efficiency upgrades, this is the impact on a number of different factors within the asset. So it's higher energy efficiency, smaller units, which means our CapEx reserves are lower maintenance because we have fewer units. All of this drives down to a higher value and a higher cash flow on the building, which then implies that there's a lower risk profile for the asset, which means the asset should see a higher return when you're selling it or refinancing it. Let's see. I want to open it up. I know I have a lot of other slides that I think are somewhat, maybe go to the next slide, Renee. But I think, I feel like we have sort of two things going here. One is sort of the financing component, and the other one is, how do you actually make the business case for these types of investments? And I mean, I think the reality is that we make the assumption that two things. One, we have to have a like for like replacement, and that's not the case. So just putting in something conventional doesn't make sense. We need to have an integrated approach to what we're choosing to put in. And when we use an integrated approach, we find that it's not like for like. So in fact, instead of saying, wow, we're doing $1 million in energy or decarbonization retrofit, it's really, we had to replace that anyway, and we were going to replace it in 5 years. So how do you do the O&M and the lighting and all that stuff to sort of save money, so that when you're ready to do it in 5 years, you have the capital, and then you upgrade what you were going to do, and that saves so much more money and increases your net operating income. So I think the conversation should be less about sort of, how do we finance these in silos, and how do we finance the whole thing as an integrated analysis? Yeah. What questions do people have? I have some other slides, but I really think that I probably could answer questions or have conversations that are Debbie's put some interesting things in the chat around some stuff that ULI's done.
Yeah, any final questions, please throw them in the chat or raise your hand. It's a good time, Molly, since there's only just a few minutes left.
Right. I want to go back to some of your early questions. Yeah, I mean, if you go to, the economic benefits here, I think are important. So I think this is the way I look at it. So when I analyze the deal, just so people, so you have a sense, I look at everything as very incremental. And I think we tend to look at it and try and make the case that you're going to have this one thing is going to be great, is huge. It's a huge benefit. For example, people say, oh, well, rent is going to be the biggest impact. Well, the reason your rent is better is because you have a higher quality asset. That's why your rent's better. Your rent's not better because you have energy efficiency in the building. It's because it's a more comfortable building and you've upgraded your systems and people want to be there. The other thing that's really important is your tenants are likely to stay. And one of the most costly parts of operating a business, a building, is because tenants leave and you have to redo the carpets and you have to clean the space and you have to re-demise all the walls. So if you can keep a tenant in your building for another 6 months or 5 years, that is one of the biggest impacts on your bottom line. And so for me, when I look at how do I analyze these types of investments, I analyze them on a very discrete, I analyze them in each little piece, and each piece feels really small, so somebody stayed 6 months, so what? Well, 6 months means I don't have to put that money out today. It also means that probably my tenant is a more stable tenant and they have less exposure to operating expenses, so they have a more stable financial footing. So you might see, a 1/4 point differential on your interest rate because you have a better tenant. You might see a 1/4 point on your discount rate when the appraiser or an investor's analyzing it. So all of these add up. And then, the benefits to me are if you get a rebate, that's even better, right? If you get a tax credit, that's even better. Long-term capital appreciation is, overall your value. And if you're a long-term holder, lower operating expenses, meaning that you have more cash to put into something else.
Thanks, Molly. We're just about at time. So that was a great place to stop. I just threw in my personal email and our info at betterbricks.com email address. Um, as you can see, there is a ton to possibly talk about here. And to Molly's credit, this leading up to this, she's like, what exactly do you guys want me to focus on? And there is so much, we're getting so much feedback about financing as a broad topic. It's really challenging to know exactly where we should focus. And so I invite everybody here. What are some specific areas that Better Bricks and Nia can focus on? What do you want to hear about more? What are some resources we should build? Help us zero in on exactly what it is that the market needs here. We really crave that feedback. So please email us. Thank you very much, Molly. We hope to hear from everybody and to go on this journey together to be compliant with these policies. Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you so much, Josh.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good one, everybody.
Bye-bye.